The Millionaire CEO humiliated the cleaning lady until her husband, a general, showed up and silenced everyone. Sometimes the most powerful moments arise not from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but from quiet dignity meeting unexpected support. This is the story of how one woman's humiliation became the catalyst for revealing who truly holds power, and how a single uniform changed everything in ways no one could have predicted. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. The elevator doors slid shut with their familiar mechanical whisper, sealing Maria Santos inside the small metal box that carried her between two worlds every morning at exactly 6:30. On the ground floor waited the city streets, where she was simply another middle-aged woman in worn sneakers and a faded jacket. But as the elevator climbed to the 15th floor of the prestigious Metropolitan Financial Building, she transformed into something else entirely, a ghost who moved through marble hallways and glass-walled offices, seen only when something needed cleaning or when someone wanted to feel superior. Maria pressed the button for the top floor and watched the numbers climb, each digit representing another layer of wealth and power that existed far above her station. She had been cleaning these offices for 7 years now, arriving before dawn and leaving after sunset, maintaining the pristine environment where million-dollar deals were negotiated and careers were made or destroyed with casual phone calls. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the executive floor, and Maria stepped out into a world of polished granite and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city skyline. Her reflection caught briefly in the gleaming surfaces. A woman in her early 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing the standard-issue uniform that marked her as part of the building's invisible workforce. As she wheeled her cleaning cart down the hallway, Maria's practiced eyes swept over the office spaces with the efficiency born of years of routine. She knew every corner, every surface, every habit of the people who worked here. The junior analysts who stayed late and left coffee rings on their desks, the department heads who never noticed when their trash cans overflowed, the secretaries who sometimes offered a tired smile when their paths crossed in empty hallways. But more than anyone else, Maria knew about Director Harrison. James Harrison occupied the corner office with its panoramic view and handcrafted furniture imported from Italy. At 52, he was the kind of man who had never been told no without consequences, who had climbed to his position through a combination of inherited connections, ruthless ambition, and a willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. His expensive suits were always perfectly pressed, his silver hair styled with military precision, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed other human beings as either useful tools or obstacles to be eliminated. Harrison had made Maria's life miserable from her first day on the job. While other executives barely acknowledged her presence, he seemed to take particular pleasure in finding fault with her work, in making subtle comments about her background, her accent, her very right to exist in his pristine professional world. She had learned to move quietly around his office, to clean efficiently and escape before he arrived each morning. But lately his schedule had become unpredictable, and their encounters were becoming more frequent and more unpleasant. This morning was no exception. As Maria began dusting the reception area outside Harrison's office, she heard his voice echoing through the partially open door, sharp and commanding as he conducted an early conference call with investors in London. His words carried the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The quarterly projections are conservative," Harrison was saying, his tone suggesting that anyone who questioned his assessment was beneath contempt. "We'll exceed those numbers by at least 15%, assuming our operational efficiency remains optimal." Maria worked silently around the reception desk, careful not to disturb any of the precisely arranged documents or the expensive crystal paperweight that Harrison's secretary had mentioned cost more than Maria's monthly salary. Every movement was calculated to avoid drawing attention to herself, but she could feel the familiar tension building in her shoulders as she sensed Harrison's presence nearby. The conference call ended abruptly, and Maria heard the sound of Harrison's chair scraping against the floor as he stood. She quickened her pace, hoping to finish her tasks and move to another area before he emerged from his office, but luck was not on her side this morning. Harrison appeared in the doorway just as Maria was reaching across the reception desk to clean the surface near the window. His presence filled the space like a cold front, bringing with it an atmosphere of barely controlled hostility that made the air feel thinner. "You're late today," he said, his voice carrying the kind of false casualness that always preceded an attack. "I specifically requested that this area be cleaned before 7:30. It's now 7:45. Maria looked up from her work, meeting his gaze briefly before lowering her eyes in the defensive posture she had learned to adopt during these encounters. "I apologize, Mr. Harrison. The elevator was slower than usual this morning, and I had to wait for—" "I don't want excuses," Harrison interrupted, his voice growing sharper. "I want competence. This is a professional environment, not a charity organization for people who can't manage to show up on time." The insult hung in the air between them, precise and calculated to wound. Maria felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm and professional. She had learned long ago that reacting to Harrison's provocations only made things worse. "Of course, sir. I'll make sure to adjust my schedule so this doesn't happen again." Harrison stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that felt deliberately threatening. His expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of cruelty that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a radiator. "See that you do," he said, his pale eyes scanning her face for signs of the effect his words were having. "Because frankly, Maria, your performance has been declining for months. I've been considering whether we really need someone with your limitations, maintaining our professional standards." The threat was clear, wrapped in corporate language, but unmistakable in its intent. Maria felt her heart rate increase as she realized that Harrison was building toward something, that this morning's encounter was different from their usual exchanges. There was a predatory quality to his attention that suggested he was preparing to escalate their conflict to a new level. "I understand, sir," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. "I take my responsibilities very seriously." "Do you?" Harrison asked, circling around her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you take this job for granted. Like you think showing up and going through the motions is enough to justify your presence in a building where real professionals are trying to accomplish important work." Other employees had begun arriving for the day, their voices carrying down the hallway as they discussed weekend plans and upcoming presentations. Maria was acutely aware that her conversation with Harrison was taking place in full view of anyone who cared to look, that her humiliation was becoming a public spectacle for the entertainment of people who earned more in a day than she made in a month. But what frightened her most was not the public nature of Harrison's attack. It was the gleam of anticipation in his eyes, the sense that he had been planning this moment and was now ready to deliver whatever blow he had been preparing. She had seen that look before, in the faces of playground bullies and abusive supervisors, the expression of someone who had found a victim they could hurt without consequences. As Maria stood there with her cleaning cart and her faded uniform, surrounded by the gleaming marble and glass that represented wealth and power beyond her imagination, she had no way of knowing that help was already on its way, walking through the building's lobby at that very moment, riding the same elevator that had carried her into this world of casual cruelty and calculated humiliation. The crystal water glass shattered against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire office space like a gunshot. Maria stood frozen, her cleaning cloth still in her hand, staring down at the fragments of expensive crystal that sparkled like diamonds across the polished stone. The glass had slipped from her fingers as she reached across Harrison's desk to clean the surface near his computer monitor. A simple accident, the kind that happened to everyone, but one that she knew would be treated as a capital offense. Harrison's reaction was immediate and volcanic. His face flushed red with rage as he shot up from his chair, his hands slamming down on his desk with enough force to make the remaining items jump and rattle. "You incompetent fool!" he roared, his voice carrying clearly through the open office space and drawing the immediate attention of every employee within hearing range. "Do you have any idea what that glass cost? Do you think I keep cheap department store garbage in my office?" Maria dropped to her knees immediately, her hands shaking as she began gathering the larger pieces of broken crystal. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrison. It was an accident. I'll pay for the replacement, I promise." "Pay for it?" Harrison's laugh was harsh and contemptuous. "With what? Your pathetic salary couldn't cover the cost of that glass if you worked for 6 months without pay. That was hand-blown crystal from Venice, part of a set that cost more than you make in a year." By now, the commotion had drawn a crowd of onlookers. Junior executives and administrative assistants had emerged from their offices and cubicles, forming a rough semicircle around the scene. Their faces showed a mixture of embarrassment, curiosity, and the uncomfortable fascination that people felt when witnessing someone else's public humiliation. Jennifer Walsh, Harrison's secretary, took a tentative step forward. "Mr. Harrison, I'm sure Maria didn't mean—" "Don't you dare defend her incompetence," Harrison snapped, wheeling around to face Jennifer with the same fury he had directed at Maria. "This is exactly the kind of bleeding heart attitude that enables mediocrity. This woman has been given chance after chance to demonstrate basic competence, and she continues to fail." Maria continued picking up glass fragments, her face burning with shame as she felt the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes watching her humiliation. She could hear whispered conversations among the employees, could sense their discomfort and pity, but also their relief that they were not the ones kneeling on the marble floor while their boss raged above them. Harrison wasn't finished. He walked around his desk to stand directly over Maria, his proximity both intimidating and deliberately degrading. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he commanded. Maria raised her eyes reluctantly, her hands still cupping pieces of broken glass. Harrison's face was contorted with an anger that seemed far out of proportion to the accident, as if the broken glass had simply provided him with an excuse to unleash fury that had been building for much longer. "7 years," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow felt more threatening than his shouting had been. "7 years I've watched you bumble through this building, leaving a trail of mediocrity and mistakes. 7 years of charity, of giving you opportunities you don't deserve and could never earn anywhere else." Tom Bradley, one of the junior analysts, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, maybe we should what?" Harrison spun toward Tom with predatory quickness. "Maybe we should continue to coddle incompetence? Maybe we should lower our standards until they match the capabilities of people who don't belong in a professional environment?" Tom stepped back, his face pale as he realized he had drawn Harrison's attention. Like everyone else in the office, he had witnessed Harrison's cruelty before, but had never been brave enough to intervene when it might cost him his own position. Harrison turned back to Maria, who was still kneeling among the glass fragments. Without warning, he kicked at the pieces she had gathered, sending them scattering across the marble floor again. "Clean it up again," he ordered, "and this time, try not to cut yourself. I don't want to deal with a workers' compensation claim on top of your incompetence." The cruelty of the gesture sent a visible shock through the assembled employees. Several people took unconscious steps backward, as if trying to distance themselves from what they were witnessing. But still, no one spoke up. The fear of losing their jobs, of becoming Harrison's next target, kept them silent. Maria began gathering the glass fragments again, her movements mechanical as she struggled to process the magnitude of what was happening. She had endured Harrison's verbal abuse for years, but this felt different, more personal, more vicious, as if he had decided to make an example of her that would remind everyone else of their place in his hierarchy. "You know what your problem is, Maria?" Harrison continued, pacing around her like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "You think you're entitled to respect you haven't earned. You think showing up and doing the bare minimum makes you valuable. But the truth is, you're nothing. You're nobody. You're easily replaceable, and the only reason you're still here is because I haven't bothered to find someone better." Each word was chosen for maximum impact, designed to strip away whatever dignity Maria had left. But Harrison wasn't satisfied with verbal humiliation alone. He walked back to his desk and picked up an open bottle of red wine that had been sitting there since the previous evening, a gift from a client that he had been sampling between phone calls. "You want to know what I think of your work?" he asked, holding the bottle above Maria's head. "This is what I think of your 7 years of dedicated service." The wine cascaded down over Maria's head and shoulders, soaking through her uniform and pooling on the marble floor around her. The liquid was cold and sticky, and the smell of expensive wine mixed with the scent of her own humiliation and fear. Gasps arose from the watching employees as they witnessed an act of cruelty so blatant that it shocked even those who had grown accustomed to Harrison's behavior. Maria knelt there dripping with wine, pieces of broken glass still cupped in her trembling hands, while Harrison stood over her with the empty bottle. For a moment, the office was completely silent except for the sound of wine dripping from her hair onto the marble floor. "There," Harrison said with satisfaction. "Now you look like what you are, trash that someone forgot to take out." It was at that exact moment, as Maria knelt on the marble floor covered in wine while Harrison savored his moment of absolute dominance, that the elevator doors opened at the far end of the hallway. The soft chime of the arriving elevator was barely audible over the sound of Harrison's heavy breathing and the whispered shock of the employees, but something about the quality of the silence that followed made everyone turn toward the sound. The figure that emerged from the elevator wore the crisp dress uniform of a military officer, complete with ribbons and insignia that spoke of years of distinguished service. The man's posture was ramrod straight, his bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command, and his eyes, when they took in the scene before him, held the kind of controlled fury that was far more dangerous than Harrison's explosive rage. Harrison, still holding the empty wine bottle, looked toward the newcomer with irritation at having his moment of triumph interrupted. "This is a private office building," he called out. "If you're looking for someone, you need to check with security downstairs." The officer said nothing. He simply began walking toward them with measured steps, his gaze fixed on Maria kneeling among the wine and broken glass. And as he approached, Maria raised her head for the first time since the humiliation had begun, and her eyes widened with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something that might have been hope. Colonel Michael Santos moved through the office space with the precise, measured steps of a man who had spent 30 years commanding respect in situations where lives depended on clear thinking and decisive action. His dress uniform bore the weight of 3 decades of service. Ribbons that told stories of deployments to places most civilians only read about in newspapers, stars that represented battles fought and won, and the quiet authority that came from making life and death decisions under pressure. He had come to surprise his wife with lunch, something he rarely had time to do during his busy schedule as regional commander. The security guard in the lobby had recognized his uniform and rank insignia immediately, directing him to the executive floor with the kind of respectful deference that military officers received from those who understood what the uniform represented. But what Colonel Santos found when the elevator doors opened was not the quiet office building he had expected. Instead, he discovered a scene that made his blood run cold, his wife kneeling on the marble floor, soaked with wine, gathering pieces of broken glass, while a man in an expensive suit stood over her holding an empty bottle. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Colonel Santos took in every detail of the tableau before him. He saw the circle of employees watching in uncomfortable silence, saw the satisfaction on Harrison's face, saw the way Maria's shoulders shook as she tried to maintain what little dignity remained to her. Most of all, he saw the casual cruelty of someone who believed he could abuse another human being without consequences. Harrison, still flushed with the power of his performance, turned toward the approaching officer with visible annoyance. "I already told you, this is a private building. Whatever you're selling or whoever you're looking for needs to be handled through proper channels downstairs." Colonel Santos continued walking forward, without acknowledging Harrison's words. His attention remained fixed on Maria, who had looked up at the sound of footsteps and now stared at her husband with a mixture of shock, relief, and mortification. She had never wanted him to see her like this, humiliated, degraded, reduced to the level Harrison had always believed she occupied. "Maria," Colonel Santos said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made everyone in the vicinity fall silent. "Are you hurt?" The simple question, asked with such gentle concern, seemed to break something inside Maria. Tears began flowing down her cheeks as she shook her head, unable to trust her voice to remain steady. She wanted to explain, to apologize, to somehow make sense of what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Harrison stepped forward aggressively, his face reddening with irritation at being ignored. "Are you deaf as well as lost?" I said, "This is a private office, and you need to leave immediately before I call security." Colonel Santos finally looked at Harrison, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The officer's gray eyes held the kind of controlled fury that experienced soldiers learn to recognize and fear, the look of a man who had seen real violence and understood exactly how to apply it when necessary. "Careful," Colonel Santos said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly through the silent office. "This woman is my wife." The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock and understanding that spread through the assembled employees. Harrison's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and then a calculating look as he tried to process this unexpected development. "Your wife?" Harrison's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "This cleaning woman is married to—" "What exactly? Some weekend warrior playing dress-up in a military costume?" Several employees shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Harrison was about to make a mistake that would have serious consequences. Tom Bradley, who had served in the National Guard before joining the financial sector, felt his stomach drop as he noticed the insignia on Colonel Santos's uniform. The man standing before them wasn't a weekend warrior or a ceremonial officer. He was the real thing, with ribbons and stars that indicated combat experience and high-level command responsibility. But Harrison, blinded by his own arrogance and the adrenaline rush of his earlier performance, couldn't see past his own assumptions about the relative importance of military service versus corporate success. "Let me explain something to you, Colonel," Harrison said, emphasizing the rank with obvious mockery. "I don't care what costume you're wearing or what games you play with your military friends. In this building, in this office, I'm the one with power. I'm the one who decides who stays and who goes, who gets respect, and who gets exactly what they deserve." Colonel Santos helped Maria to her feet with gentle hands, steadying her as she swayed slightly from the shock of everything that had happened. He removed his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, covering the wine-stained uniform with the dignity of his own military bearing. "Are you sure you're not hurt?" he asked her quietly, his voice filled with the kind of tenderness that made several female employees in the watching crowd feel tears gathering in their own eyes. Maria shook her head again, leaning against her husband's strength as she tried to process the surreal nature of the situation. One moment, she had been alone and helpless, kneeling in humiliation while Harrison displayed his power over her. Now she stood protected by the man she loved, wrapped in his jacket that carried the scent of honor and integrity. Harrison's face had grown even redder as he realized he was being ignored. "I'm talking to you, soldier boy. Don't you understand basic courtesy? When someone of my position addresses you, you respond with the respect I'm due." Colonel Santos turned toward Harrison with the kind of deliberate movement that made Tom Bradley take several steps backward. The junior analyst had seen that look before, in the faces of drill sergeants who were about to deliver lessons that recruits never forgot. "Respect," Colonel Santos repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet. "You want to talk about respect?" "That's right," Harrison said, his confidence building as he interpreted the officer's calm tone as submission. "I'm the chief executive of this company. I control budgets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I have connections in government and business that you can't even imagine. Your little military games might impress civilians, but in the real world, in the world where actual power matters, you're nothing." The silence that followed Harrison's declaration was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had marked the earlier confrontation. This was the silence of people holding their breath, waiting for an explosion that they sensed was about to reshape everything they thought they understood about power, authority, and the consequences of crossing lines that should never be crossed. Colonel Santos looked around the circle of watching faces, taking in their expressions of fear, anticipation, and growing understanding. When he spoke again, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers in situations where the wrong decision meant death. "Mr. Harrison," he said, and something in the way he pronounced the civilian title made it sound almost quaint. "I think it's time you learned exactly who you're talking to." Colonel Santos reached into his breast pocket with deliberate precision, withdrawing a leather folder that bore the embossed seal of the Department of Defense. He opened it to reveal credentials that made Tom Bradley's face go completely white. "I am Colonel Michael Santos, Regional Commander of the 3rd Military District," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority that made everyone stand straighter. "I oversee military operations, security clearances, and defense contracts for this entire region. That includes the aerospace contracts your company depends on for 40% of its annual revenue." Harrison's confident expression began to waver as the implications penetrated his arrogance. He had built his career on understanding power structures, but was suddenly confronting authority that existed entirely outside his sphere of influence. "Furthermore," Colonel Santos continued, "I coordinate with federal agencies on security clearance investigations for government project workers. I believe several of your employees require such clearances." Jennifer Walsh felt her stomach drop, remembering the security clearance renewal forms she had submitted 2 weeks earlier, forms that could be revoked if investigators discovered behavior calling someone's judgment into question. Harrison tried to rally. "Military authority doesn't extend to civilian workplaces. You have no jurisdiction here." Colonel Santos smiled coldly. "You're right, but I do have authority over military contracts, security clearances, and relationships with defense contractors. I'm very interested in companies that demonstrate leadership and ethical standards suitable for sensitive government work." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Harrison's lucrative defense contracts could be terminated if questions arose about corporate culture or leadership judgment. "You can't threaten me because your wife can't do her job properly," Harrison persisted. "Cleaning woman?" Colonel Santos's voice dropped dangerously. "My wife holds a master's degree from Columbia University. She worked as a high school principal for 15 years before budget cuts eliminated her position. She's completing her doctoral dissertation in educational psychology." The revelation thundered through the assembled employees. They had dismissed Maria as just the cleaning lady, while she was more educated than most of them and had shaped hundreds of students' minds. Harrison's face went pale. That's irrelevant. She's employed as cleaning staff and needs to meet those standards. Standards, Colonel Santos repeated. Let's discuss the standard of leadership that humiliates employees publicly. The professionalism of pouring wine over someone's head for an accident. Tom Bradley found his voice. Sir, what happened today was cruel and unprofessional. Harrison spun toward Tom furiously, but Jennifer Walsh stepped forward. Tom's right. I've watched you treat Maria terribly for years. What you did was inexcusable. You're both fired, Harrison snapped, but his words carried less conviction. The room's dynamic had shifted fundamentally. Other employees began speaking up, their voices gaining strength as they realized Harrison's power had been largely illusory, dependent on fear rather than real authority. Remember when you made that intern cry over the wrong coffee cup? Asked David Martinez. What about screaming at maintenance for 20 minutes over office temperature? Added Lisa Park. Years of suppressed anger poured out. Harrison stood at the storm's center, his authority crumbling as colleagues finally stood up to his abuse. You can't all turn against me, Harrison said desperately. I built this department. You owe your jobs to me. We owe our jobs to our own competence, Tom replied confidently. You've taken credit for others' work while treating people like garbage. Colonel Santos reached for his phone deliberately. I'm calling the Inspector General's office. They investigate companies holding defense contracts with toxic leadership cultures. Harrison went white, understanding the implications. An IG investigation could destroy every government contract his company held. Wait, he said desperately. We can work this out internally. Maria, I'm sorry. I lost my temper. But Maria, wrapped in her husband's jacket and surrounded by colleagues finally seeing her humanity, looked directly at Harrison without lowering her eyes. No, Mr. Harrison, she said clearly. Today, everyone has seen who really lacks competence in this office, and it isn't me. 3 months later, Maria sat in the same conference room where Harrison had once conducted intimidating performance reviews, but everything had changed. She wore a professional business suit instead of a cleaning uniform, her hair styled elegantly, carrying herself with the dignity of someone finally recognized for who she truly was. Detective Parker from Corporate Crimes Division sat across from her with documentation of Harrison's criminal charges. Beside him was Margaret Chen from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, whose presence indicated federal investigations had been triggered. Dr. Santos, Detective Parker said, using her proper title, we've reviewed security footage and statements from 14 witnesses. Pouring wine over someone constitutes battery under state law. Mr. Harrison will be arraigned next week. Maria nodded calmly, despite her trembling hands. I want to press charges, not just for me, but for everyone he mistreated. Someone needs to show this behavior has consequences. Margaret Chen consulted her tablet. We've received formal complaints from 27 current and former employees. The pattern of harassment and hostile work environment violations is extensive. Through the glass walls, Maria could see the transformed office floor. Harrison's empty office stood packed with supervised boxes. An interim manager had created a lighter atmosphere than anyone remembered. Tom Bradley knocked and entered with a folder. Dr. Santos, these are support letters from colleagues providing character references. 43 so far. Maria accepted the folder with surprise. These same people had walked past her for years, treating her as invisible furniture. Now they actively supported her, finally seeing her as a colleague. The board of directors wants to offer you a position in corporate training, Tom continued excitedly, developing workplace respect and ethical leadership programs. The irony was perfect. The woman Harrison had tried to humiliate as nobody would now teach executives how to treat employees with dignity. After the officials left, Colonel Santos arrived in dress uniform, as he had daily since the incident. His presence sent clear messages about consequences while reminding Maria of her worth. "How did it go?" he asked, settling beside her protectively. "Harrison's going to jail," Maria replied simply, "and they offered me the training position." Colonel Santos smiled with pride. From cleaning floors to training executives, perfect justice. Maria pulled out a business card. "The EEOC wants me consulting on new harassment prevention guidelines. They think my education background and personal experience make me uniquely qualified." Through the windows, employees moved with different energy than during Harrison's reign. People talked and laughed, behaving like humans rather than fearful subordinates. Jennifer Walsh had been promoted and implemented respectful workplace policies. Lisa Park from Human Resources appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Santos, thank you for your courage standing up to Mr. Harrison. You've inspired many of us to demand better treatment everywhere we work." As they prepared to leave together, Maria reflected on her transformation from invisible cleaning woman to workplace dignity advocate. "You know the best part?" she asked her husband at the elevator. "What's that?" Maria looked around the office one final time. "Harrison spent years trying to make me feel worthless, but his cruelty just revealed my actual strength. He thought he was destroying me, but he set the stage for me to discover who I really am." As the elevator doors opened, their reflection showed a military officer and educator standing as equals, ready to face a world where justice had been served and dignity restored. Maria had learned that dignity couldn't be given or taken by others, only recognized or ignored, and she was done allowing anyone to ignore it ever again.